Good afternoon. My name is Bill Owen. I worked on the Trans Am project, and unlike Mr. Ewell that had a directive from General Motors, our group did not have a directive. It was started out by Tom Goad at Pontiac, and Pontiac is no more as a car company. However, they've had many outstanding achievements and performance benchmarks throughout the history, such as winning the U.S. Nationals at NHRA U.S. Nationals in 1960 in Superstock, winning the 1961 Daytona 500, setting the land speed record at Bonneville at over 400 miles an hour, and also the creation of the GTO, which started the whole muscle car era. These are many of the highlights that quickly come to mind when you think of Pontiac. Now, May 30th, 1989, the Indy 500, there was another moment where a true production engine, EPA legal, street legal performance car paced the race. This is the story of that. Trans Am pace car did not start out as the Indy 500 pace car. It started out in a conversation between Tom Goad, who was the specialty vehicles manager for Pontiac, and a fellow named Milt Shornack that used to work for Royal Pontiac. He was the performance manager and drag race person at Royal. And they had a conversation. Mr. Goad used to race, at that time he was racing SCCA Firehawk Series road racing, and he wanted a more powerful engine because he was only using a 305 tune port and injection in his Trans Am, and they had a tough time running against the Porsches and the Corvettes and other things that ran in that class. And Mr. Shornack, in this conversation, he says, well, why don't we use the Buick Grand National Regal engine and put it in the Trans Am, because it's the most powerful engine General Motors making at the time. And he thought about it, and he gave it some thought, and he says, well, tell you what, do you think we could build one or two of these prototypes? And they said, well, I think so. But then Mr. Goad, throughout this whole project, oh, I'll blow your ears out. You don't want that. The whole project was never a real project like Mr. Ewell and Mr. Manor are generally dealing with. Mr. Goad didn't have very much money, and they didn't have Pontiac supporting it, so they built the first two prototypes in the Pontiac engineering garage. And they got the engines, I believe, from Buick Engineering, and they built one stick and one automatic. Can you get us the white car? One more. This car. This was one of the original prototypes. And it looks pretty good in this picture, but if you raise the hood, it was a pretty tough car. They built one stick and one automatic, and they got them running, and they couldn't calibrate them very well because at this time, fuel injection was very new. They didn't know how to do that. So the people at PASS, who Mr. Kelly used to work for, they were working on some of Tom Goad's Firehawk road racing cars, and they had a fellow there named Rich Anderson, and he could calibrate a fuel injection prom in the computer, so they calibrated it and got it running. Well, they had a lot of trouble, and they actually blew the pistons out of it once. They blew the head gaskets out of it another time, and some other problems. And they kind of quit working on it for a while. And let's go back to the GTO. This is how I got involved in it. They were having a lot of trouble, and I believe, I'm not positive, but they approached Buick Engineering for help, and they helped them a little bit, and for whatever reason, then Buick Engineering couldn't help them anymore. And I used to work when I was a kid. I used to go down to Royal Pontiac and hang out, and when I was a teenager, and Milt Shornack was the performance manager there, and he knew me. And go up one more, the picture with the, no, back, this way, there. This fella right here, his name's Van Seymour, and he was very well connected with Pontiac. He used to race Pontiacs. And he was connected with John DeLorean at Pontiac, the general manager. But also, I used to go over and help him on this car in his garage. And that was quite a while ago in the 60s. Well, I went over there in December 1986 just to see him, and we were talking in his garage, and he told me that Milt Shornack wanted to talk to me and wanted me to work on a Trans Am with a turbo Buick V6 engine. And I said, well, I don't know. I don't think I could help him. Well, anyway, I gave him his phone number, and they called me at work 3 or 4 weeks later. And they formally asked me to come help them. And I said I didn't know what I could do, but before that, I was the senior manufacturing engineer for engine testing and also over warranty analysis at the Buick engine plant, where they made the Buick V6s and the turbo engines for the Buick Grand National Regals at that time. And I said, I can't really come help you because that's not in the way of line of demarcation, and then I would probably get in a lot of trouble. So what they did, they found out who was my boss's boss, who was the superintendent of master mechanics of the engine plant, named Darrell Galbraith. And they called him and told him they wanted me to come help him. So he called me in the office and told me, you can go down there and help them, but you can't spend any money, and you want to do it, you know, late in the afternoon, and make sure you don't do something that was formally done. So I went down, and let's go to the white car again. Nope, next. Down there. This car was sitting in, I met Mr. Goad, I'd never met him before, and we went down in the parking lot, and he had 2 of these cars. He had this one and an automatic, and they looked just alike. And he showed me, he said, well, we got a few problems with this, and we think you can help us. Few was a very mild, he was being very diplomatic. He started outlining some of the problems, and to get the Buick Grand National Regal in the car, on the right side, the frame rail, they'd taken a chunk out of there, about 2 inches, because they couldn't get the turbo out exhaust pipe down between the engine and the right-hand side of the exhaust manifold of the Grand National engine. Well, they'd done that, and also it started up, and it had this bad vibration ringing. It went into a large. I'm sorry, I can't. Can you turn the speaker? I can't talk to the people in the other room, but I can talk this way. I'm sorry. So we looked at it, and he said, well, let's go drive it. So we drove one of them, and it belched big blue smoke out the back of the tailpipe. And then we drove the other one, and it didn't drive very well. It had hesitations, and I could even tell it was spark knocking. It was vibrating. It wasn't very good either. And he says, well, we'd like you to help us fix it. And I was very diplomatic how I told him. I said, well, I don't know what I can do. We've got to get some instrumentation and look at it. So I says, I'll see what I can come up with. And I went back and I reported my superior, Mr. Galbraith, and told him, it looks like to me we're going to have to give them 2 engines to start over, because they got the blue smoke out was the turbo seal in the turbocharger bearings, and they would go out, and they'd somehow ruin those, and it would look like a mosquito sprayer, smoke coming out of it. And, no, I'm not exaggerating. It was pretty bad. And then the other one, I didn't know exactly what was wrong with it, but it was hurt. So he says, well, you got some of these returns down there. He says, see if you could patch up a couple of the, we couldn't sell them after they came back from the dealer, and I did return analysis for warranty purposes. And so I had a repairman who worked with me, and his name was John Larman. He was a repairman at the end of the assembly line, and so we put together a couple engines, and we sent them down there. And Mr. Goad was very, very appreciative, and I went down to engineering. I knew some people that worked there, and we cut a prom. Back then, you couldn't calibrate it off a laptop. You had a prom burner, and you burn these proms, and that was the calibration. And so I got the guy to make me a couple conservative ones so that we knew we weren't going to overspark it or do something, and it had a little less boost, but it would run. So we sent that with the engines, and then I didn't hear from him again for a while. And then Mr. Goad called me up and had me come down. And by now, they had the cars at PASS, at Prototype Automotive Services. I went down there and I drove them, and they drove pretty good. They were not as good as the ones you have now, but it was definitely better than any V8 they had. You could tell right away. And so he says, well, you know, we'd like to do something. I said, well, okay. And he suggested he bring it back up to the engine plant and thank our management for helping him. And so they came up and they did a little presentation about what was in the cars, and they let our plant manager and the master mechanic and superintendent of the assembly line and some of the other guys that were interested, they all got turns to ride in the car. And they gave a little presentation of what it was and what it entailed to do this. And our plant manager he wasn't a real performance enthusiast, but he understood business. And at that time, the 3.8 liter V6 was not held in high esteem like a 3800 is today. And we were kind of slowly losing business. And he was looking for some extra volume that we could sell some engines to one of the car divisions, because we were kind of losing ground. And we knew that later on, a couple years, we're going to switch over to the first 3800 Series 1, and it was going to not be as high a volume. So we're going to have a whole line of block line, head line, intake manifold line, exhaust manifold line, cam line, just sitting there doing nothing. And he was kind of looking for some business. So he didn't say, yeah, we're going to do this, but he says, he kind of made it okay to go ahead. And they did a formal cost study with the car assembly plant, which was then at Van Nuys, California. And they decided that they looked it all over, what it would take to maybe make 5,000 or 10,000 units of this, which is a very low volume for General Motors. And they looked it all over, and the big cut out of the right side frame rail, it was going to cost $3 million to retool that in the car assembly plant. See, the Trans Ams at that time had just switched over to a unibody construction, where the Buick Grand National was still a body-on-frame construction, and that left more room in the engine compartment like in a Grand National. And when you start working on a unibody car, you've got the great big dies and the big welding fixtures in the car assembly plant, very expensive, and it probably would have cost more than that if we actually would have done it. So they decided after that, we had a meeting, and they decided to cancel the project. It says, well, we just can't do it. They called up Mr. Godin, told him we appreciate it, you know, bring up the cars, and that was it. And it stayed there for about 2 months. And, so I was working downstairs with my repairman, Mr. Larman, and we were working on regular dealer returns. And I happened to see a Grand National Regal engine, this engine, and a front-wheel drive. We were building an '86 model year by then. It was a front-wheel drive engine for the LeSabre, Pontiac Bonneville, and the Buick Park Avenue. And they were hanging on the line, one right behind the other. And I'm looking at that, and I'm thinking, you know, the rear-wheel drive engine is narrower than the front-wheel drive engine, excuse me, I misspoke myself. The front-wheel drive engine is narrower than the rear-wheel drive. And I says, you know, if we put those heads on the rear-wheel drive block, I think we could get that exhaust manifold down there without slicing the taking a big slice out of the front frame rail of the Trans Am. And Mr. Larman, we talked it over, and he says, I don't think all that stuff will fit. And I thought it would, because we hadn't gone to the 3800 yet and moved the center line of the bores and moved everything. And so I got some heads, and I got a head gasket, and we went to lunch, and we come back, and we started working on we had an extra turbo engine there. It had come back from a dealer, and we took it all apart, and we started measuring it up. The head gaskets fit, the heads fit, and then we had to get head bolts, because in the front-wheel drive, it didn't torque just regular torque. It was one of the first times which Buick pioneered was called torque-to-yield bolts. Very common in General Motors and many of the manufacturers today. It's called torque plus angle. If you don't just put a torque on it, but you torque it to a certain level, and then you apply a number of degrees of rotation. And so we did that, and we got it put together, but we didn't have any exhaust manifolds. And then we put all the front dress and the turbo, and when the intake manifold off of the turbo would fit, because we still had the two ports together, and one port, it was like that. And this is the head on that side of the table is the front wheel drive head, and this is the normal Regal Grand National head, and everything fit. So we fired it up, and it ran. And well, nobody thought, my repairman didn't think it would work either, and nobody had done that. They didn't even think about it. You know, we were working towards getting the next model year running, and you didn't do that kind of thing in the factory. And so we didn't have any exhaust manifolds, a little loud, and there's a fellow named Clark Berry who was the superintendent of the assembly line, and he kind of liked the performance stuff. So I went up and told him, I says, you know, I got a solution for our Trans Am that we just canceled here a few months ago that the Pontiac came up and showed us. And he says, and I told him what I did. He said, oh, that won't fit. I says, well, you come down and you look, and we got one running downstairs. And he said, well, okay. So he goes downstairs, and we fired up and ran it for him, and he just stood there and looked at it. I said, well, I'll be darned. He says, well, what do you want to do? I says, well, I don't know. We'd like to send it down to him. And he says, well, he says, tell you what. He says, I'll write your pass, but he says, we don't have any money. He says, since the program's canceled, I don't dare put anything that shows that we shipped this out of here. So I got it down there and just dropped it off. And I don't know if Mr. Kelly here or Billy Briggs was their engine builder at Pass. Somebody took it out. It was late in the evening. It was about 6:30, 7 o'clock, and they took it out and just set it on the floor, and I left. Well, about 3 or 4 days later, I didn't tell anybody. So Mr. Goad calls me from Pontiac. He says, where'd you get that engine? I says, I made it. He said, what do you mean you made it? I says, no, I made it. I said, my repairman and I would put it together. He says, well, I want you to come down here. I says, well, why? I says, I just dropped it off. You guys can do what you want. No, I want you to come down. Let's go back to the white car. So what they done, he found out right away. Mr. Beitzel that owned Pass at the time, I worked with him too and knew him. And he already figured out what it was. He saw it there. He realized right away. So in 3 days, they'd had the other engine out of the car. They put the one I'd built for it in and was setting in the car, wired up, hosed up, but they didn't have any exhaust manifolds. He says, we need some exhaust manifolds for this thing. And I says, well, I can't help you. I mean, you guys got very talented fabricators and, you know, machinists and people here to do that. He said, no, we want you to help. I said, look, I can't come down here and do that. So I went back to work and got a call from Mr. Galbraith a day or so later. He says, well, Pontiac seems to think that you can help them and go down there and do something on this car. He says, no, you got 3 days, and that's it. He says, you'll be back here. And he says, you better not be spending any of our money. I says, okay. So I went down, and what they did, they gave me this, I forget the guy's name, but he was an extremely talented fabricator. And they also says, when you get done, we've got a draftsman, and we're going to draw this up.
Van Auken.
Dan Van Auken, okay. And, you know, these guys were very, very talented folks. And we started working on it, and I realized right away, if we were to make this into a production program, we can't, I'd just like to make a set of headers, you know, something to flow nice and come up and run the turbo. No, we got to do this more like production. And I'd worked on the Buick Grand National Regal's exhaust manifolds, and they had a lot of cracking originally before they ever produced them. And I got to work on that, and I thought, if we ever do that and we have a crack with this one and we were running it, we won't get another chance. So we went over to the place, I think it was R&B Manufacturing, and I took the fabricator with me, and we looked at the fixtures that they were making the manifolds on, and we took some measurements, and they gave us some flanges and some parts, and what we tried to do was make it so it would run over those fixtures and not change very much, because we knew we didn't have a program, you know, a formal thing with General Motors backing it. So that's what we made, and then the manifolds that you have on your cars today were made that way. And I made a 3-into-1, but instead of having a real nice collector, I had to make it so it was more production collector, and then we tucked it in around the bottom of the transmission. And on the passenger side, that was the one we had cracking, and I almost made a nice 3-into-1 to that, but I thought if I knew about the cracking, so we just tucked it in a little bit and tried to make everything a little more robust, a little stronger, a little thicker, and we made one for them, and then we got the draftsman to come over and he started drawing it. We made 3 or 4 more because they had a sister car to this one, the automatic car. And then we had a couple more. Mr. Goad wanted one for the draftsman and one for a dyno that I think Mr. Kelly worked on. And so that's what we did. And then I went back to and did my own job at up in the engine plant for a while. We didn't hear very much about it. And what happened was that Mr. Goad then took these cars and he showed it to Pontiac upper management. And a fellow named Byron Warner was the chief engineer of Pontiac, and he backed Mr. Goad. Mr. Goad actually was the guy pushing this whole thing. But Byron Warner, the chief engineer, and Mike Losh was the general manager of the division of Pontiac. He kind of backed it. They didn't, at that time, they were under what they called the new organization called CPC. It was called Chevrolet Canada Pontiac, and Buick was under BOC, Buick Olds Cadillac. And Pontiac was supposed to use all Chevrolet engines. That's how it was stacked up. Well, Mr. Lash understood that a lot of the things that came to make Pontiac great was they had their own engines. And he could see what this was already coming to. They drove it and they knew. So he kind of tacitly supported it under the table. And they went over and drove it, and they thought, we understand what we have here, but now we got to somehow make this happen. So let's go to the gray car. So Mr. Goad called me up and says, why don't you come down? I said, okay, I'll come down in the evening. I come down there, and they walked out in the back of the shop, and here sat this gorgeous gray, silver gray, brand new Trans Am. It had 5 miles on it. It had the gold wheels, the gold emblems. It was beautiful. He says, I want you to build another one of those engines for us. We're going to put it in here. We don't want all the wires and hoses and thermocouples and all that stuff running around. We want to make it just like a production car. And I'd never worked on one like that before. Everything I'd worked on were prototypes, and there were always cut holes in the dash, and we had wires running all over it, and thermocouples, and you know, I just thought, I can't do that. You know, he says, no, we want you to do it, and you do a good job for us. I said, okay, so we had Billy Briggs, we had Jeff Bites, the owner of the place, we had Rich Anderson, we had Mr. Kelly, we had Mr. Van Auken, all these guys helping. We made it as close we could get to production. When you open the hood, you swear it was all the regular connections were there, the real hoses. We didn't have braided steel and fittings running all over. And we built that car, and then it was a little later when we got it finished, and he wanted me to come down and drive it. So I took it one evening. We backed it out of the pass. They had a big garage door where you could back cars in and out. I backed it, started up and backed it out, and I stopped just before I got outside. Other thing that Mr. Goad failed to tell me, way back when I first started working on these cars, they had a tremendous vibration and a ringing. The body would go into a harmonic, and it would ring so bad at certain engine speeds and road speeds that a few times when I drove it, I would drive it with the earmuffs on because it was so bad. And this thing was worse. And the radio, the dash was vibrating so bad, I thought the radio was going to fall out. And he said, no, we still want to go for a ride. So we took it for a little ride and come back, and he says, you know, Tom, we're not going to get any place. We've been chasing that around. You've been chasing around a long time before I started working on it, and we can't fix this. I said, we can't sell this car. He says, yeah, I know, but he says, I know we can solve it. I says, I understood that to mean somebody else is going to have to solve it because it wasn't going to happen that way. And we chased that around for another 6 months. We took the engine out of the car, brought it back to the engine plant. We balanced it. I was over also the engine balancing in the engine plant. And we calibrated a balance stand to 0, 0, 0, as good as we can get it. We balanced that thing to 3 decimal places, put it back in the car. Didn't do anything. And Mr. Goad tried a lot of things. And at that time, I was racing on my own, and there's a fellow out in the East Coast named Eddie Quay that built a lot of these cars for NHRA Superstock drag racing, where they cut the rear of the whole car out and they tub them and put the big roll cages in and everything. And I talked to him a number of occasions, and he said, he always called them flexible flyers. He says, you have to brace that car up. And we talked, I asked him about it, and he didn't know either, but finally he told me, he says, look, he says, where is the vibration coming from? I says, it comes right through the driver's seat, and it comes through the floorboard right where you put your, that's the worst, and the rest of it's all over, but that's the worst place. He said, well, then put the car up in a hoist and take a look at what's different under there. And I did. We had that in a V8 car. I'm looking, well, the big torque arm that goes from the rear end up to the transmission on a V8, it bolts into the transmission, and we did that with a extra bracket onto the back of the Buick transmission, and did it the same way. And I'm looking at that, and I thought, that's the only difference that we could see. And so I got Mr. Beitzel, he came out, and we had the fabricators make us a new cross member, and we moved that off and put it in a Heim joint and put it, isolated it on a bracket away from the transmission. And so that fixed the problem. It was like magic. I mean, you start that thing, and it was smooth. It was almost all of it, although for maybe commercial it had a little bit, because I drove so many of them you could feel it. And I went back to the engine plant, and I took a piece of our flexible exhaust manifold tubing that we use for hooking up the production engines, made by Flexonics. And we cut that, and I had Mr. Van Alken put it in there. And we put that next to a V8 car, and we got it close where you could put your hands on both the engines, and it was smoother. It was just like magic. And so Gold took the car, and I figured, well, you know, we got this pretty good. So I went back to work, and I got a call. It was about 2 weeks later, and Beitzel called me. And he didn't call me very often. He says, why don't you come down to Mile and Dragway? And he says, I want you to be there. He says, at a certain time, like 11 o'clock or something. And so I rolled down there, and they had all these cars there, and some very high General Motors management. Mr. Lash was there, Mr. Gold was there, Byron Warner, but they had some higher level people, and Lloyd Royce was there, the president of General Motors, and they had a number of cars. They had a Porsche, they had Mustangs, they had Camaros, they had Corvette, they had some Dodge stuff. I think, what they have else, I don't know, a Renault Turbo, they might have had a Lotus, some other stuff. And they were running down the drag strip, and he says, they got this, and I called this the Gray Ghost, because it was a pretty good car. And I did a lot of testing with it. I did a lot of the drag strip testing, because Mr. Beitzel and Tom Goad, they were road racers, and they did a lot of the brakes and the ride and handling stuff, but they liked me to do the drag racing, because I was a drag racer. And I had run the fastest I'd run with this car in testing earlier, and the white car, was a 1367, 102.9 miles an hour. And we knew that was way faster than a Corvette. In fact, we had a Corvette that was owned by Pass.
The accountant.
And yeah, he was the accountant. There was a red Corvette, and it was really consistent. And every hour or two when we were testing, we'd run it down the track to see if anything changed. And that car would never, it would only vary a hundredth or two. It was 1440 to 1444 every run. And we could blister that thing. So we knew what was going on, and Beitzel and Gold got me aside, and he says, this is on the ride, and this is for the next 2 or 3 years, and he says, they're going to decide in a day or two whether we're going to build this thing. And he says, I got this on the ride, and he said, now they'll go from here, they go do a highway, and they go up in some hills, and then they went and do city traffic, then they had a meeting. And so I says, okay. So I was kind of taken back. I'd never been at that level of stuff before, and I just watched it all, and so I went back to work. And about a week later, Mr. Goad called me and says, hey, he says, we have a program. I says, what does that mean? He says, no, we have a real production program, and we're going to make these things. And I says, well, you better send something to our management in the engine plant, because they don't know exactly this is going on. So then they had to send a formal thing that, well, our engine plant's going to build these, and Buick Engineering's going to support it, and all that kind of stuff. And that's kind of how it went. And it became later that Pontiac management decided to make it a pace car in 1989, because this was in the fall of 1988. It was about, I don't know, July or August, this ride took place. 87. And it took place, and it takes a while to get all this stuff in order and then make a program. But when they decided to make a car for the Indianapolis 500, there's very stringent performance criteria you have to meet. It's just not take a pretty fast car and go down there. You have to accelerate out of the pits and into the first turn, and by the time you get to the middle of between 1 and 2, you got to be going 120. You got brake tests. You have to do 120 to 0 in, I don't know, it's 134 feet or something, and then you got to go out in the track and you got to go simulate the start of the race. You got to go down the back straight at 70. Accelerate up to 90, and then you got to punch it, and you got to come out into turn 3 and out of turn 4. You got to be going over 120, and then make the turn into the pits and slow it down. And they sent just the car, just like you guys drive, a street car. They drove it down there, and a fella, if I'm not mistaken, I don't know if Tom Goad went or Jim Lyons. Jim Lyons was also, he was the product manager of the Firebird, and he became associated with it after we got a program. So he goes down there, and he's talking to the Indy 500 people. They had I believe it was Arlen Fingler, and they had another guy that was the head of the competition director, and then they have usually a couple race drivers, older race drivers, that do testing for them and stuff. So they're all talking, and Mr. Lyons says, yeah, he says, well, finally they're talking. He says, where is your big truck with the real pace car? He says, that's the real pace car. And they kind of look at each other and say, yeah, well, you know, and they're talking over here, and said, well, they haven't been here in a while. They don't really know. we'll let them go out and try this thing. We still got time, you know, it's October. They got 4 or 5 months to really make a real pace car. So he says, well, told the driver, get in with this Mr. Lyons, go take it for a run, and we'll see. Then we'll educate him. So Jim Lyons gets in, puts on his helmet, and he goes out and gets on in the pits, and they go out in turn 1, and he's putting down the back straight, and he punches it, and he comes out of turn 4, and he's starting to get it. And they had the clocks on him, and he goes 142 miles an hour past the start-finish line. Just zoom, and then he just kind of lets up a little bit, tapped the brakes a little, down in turn 1, boom, where he went like, you know, the thing's really cruising by then. And he made a couple laps, and they come in, and Mr. Fingler kind of pulls up and stops, and he just looks at that thing. He said, he just didn't know what to say. He says, what have you got in this thing? You must have a big block in it or something, big block Chevy. They open it up, and it's a Buick V6, and they just couldn't believe it. Well, I think I got to go for a ride in it now. So he gets in it, and he and the race driver took it for a few more laps, and they just couldn't believe it. But the real essence of the car was the Pontiac wanted to say that they had a real production car built down the assembly line in Flint, Michigan, with the regular people that built these cars every day, that it was warranted, it was EPA legal, it was emission legal, and you could drive it on the street with the catalytic converter, the air conditioner, everything, and you could go out and run in front of the race cars. And pretty much that's what we did. So, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Kelly. And when they got a when we got it in production, that's what you folks drive today.
Oh, before you go, I'd like you to tell them what's different about the engine. You know, the crankshaft.
Well,
the oil
there's a
pumps
lot of
deal?
differences. It's not a real Grand National Regal. And it was like getting to go behind a real championship team. The people at Buick, and which I was a part of in the engine plant, not in the engineering at that time, they built a great engine. You got to remember, back then they were emission controlled. We had, this was the era of a 170 horsepower Corvette. You know, a car that could run even 14.8 seconds was a phenomenon back then. You know, they destroyed all the muscle cars. And they had fuel injection. They had crank trigger ignition. We had a turbo. We had electronic controls. This was like cutting edge stuff at that time. And those folks did a heck of a job. There was no way I could have ever done anything without having all that basic in front of me. So, but when I put the front wheel drive heads on this thing, I got some pretty good engineering. We didn't have very good valve stem seals on the engine. And the 86, 87 front wheel drive had those. We had better rocker arms. We had a better PCV system on a Grand National Regal. Sometimes it will suck the oil out of the right hand rocker arm cover up into the turbo, right into the intake. Kaboom, there goes the head gaskets, am I right? You've done that before, huh? But you know about that. And this one had it already repaired, and it was on the other side. We even had better rocker arm covers. We had
Inconel valves.
Yeah, we had better valves. We had a better combustion chamber. And that was one of the things, one way we could get this car built, we piggybacked the emissions on top of the Grand National Regal. And the front wheel drive head had a smaller combustion chamber, and it upped the compression ratio. And we ran quite a few of them. We ran the old white car with the higher compression ratio, and the best 0 to 60 I ever ran was a 4.9 0 to 60. And that was as good as some of the Ferraris at that time. A flat 12 Testarossa Ferrari, we could match them. And Mr. Hulka, sitting in the back here, was the piston engineer, and I knew him. And we figured to make this thing go, we had to, I didn't want to change the head. We couldn't change the head. That's what we're going to get. And we really didn't want to run it at 9-to-1 compression or 9.5, whatever it came out as. So I went down and saw him. He's a good friend of mine. And I asked him, could you deepen the dish and the piston for this thing? Because I'd give him a number of rides in it. We went out, and he likes that stuff too. And he said, yeah, and he did some calculations. He called me up a couple days later. He said, yeah, we could do it, and this is how we could do it. And I says, well, if we ever do this thing, if we get a program, we're going to have to do that, because I don't think we're going to pass emissions, or they don't want to. And so then my management called me in after we got the program, and they says, you know, the Grand National, our V6 doesn't have the best warranty. and Pontiac's calling up wanting to know what are we going to do about it to get the warranty down because they don't think it's acceptable. And Mr. Clark over here that worked for the racing department, we had done a lot of oil. They had certain classes they used dry sump oil systems in regular real race cars, but they had some classes where they had to use a wet sump system, and they had to use the production front cover with a distributor. And we'd made them some better oil pumps, and I made them for our production facility. I was over a oil pump functional test where we could actually test the oil pumps before we put them on the engine, which was a great help. And so what we did for him in his department, that we ran them and we sorted them, and we got them at the high limit of the pumps, and then we give them to them, and they ran real well. They even ran, you know what the nationwide series is in NASCAR today? Well, it was called Busch back then, and they ran some of those engines in Busch Grand National races with our dry sump, without the dry sump system, with the regular production front covers, and they did pretty good. So I said, well, the two things I know, I would hand sort all the oil pumps, and then secondly, I'd cross drill the crank. And he worked for Mr. Clark's friend of mine, and he did a lot of the race stuff. And all the Indy 500 engines and the race Buicks all had cross drill crankshafts, and they didn't have any trouble. And we had some bearing trouble with our Buicks once in a while, or we'd have more than we wanted. So that's what I told my manager. We were going to cross drill the crank and we'll sort the pumps. And he said, that's all you do? I says, well, everything else. We got really good head gaskets. We torque to yield. We got that fixed. We got better head. We got better valves. We got valve stem seals. We got all this stuff for nothing. And also the exhaust manifolds, I knew we had cracking, and I specified a 321 stainless steel instead of 409, which was more expensive, but I knew I didn't know if that would take care of it, but it was the best we knew. And we got all the stuff in there. I says, I don't know what else to do. And we got a piston, we lowered the compression ratio. I says, we don't know anything else except we build out an out racing engine. That's not the scope of this project. They said, well, okay. So that's what they did. And they talked to the crankshaft department, and they said, well, how would we do this? And they said, well, we'll run it halfway down through the crankshaft department. We'll take it out. And we took it to the Buick tool room, which is a beautiful facility with these. At that time, they had state-of-the-art machining facilities. And they were way ahead of anybody race shop at that time. And they cross-drilled every crank. We built 1,500 of them. And then we brought them back, put them in the crank department, and then finished them. And those are the things we put in. And Mr. Goad had to do a presentation a year later after we'd sold all these cars to you folks. And they've been out there for a year. And it ended up being the lowest warranty Pontiac Firebird they'd ever made, even though you run them hard. So we must have done it correctly. But we had a lot of good help. We had Buick Engineering, had Buick Racing Department, we had Pontiac. Mr. Goad specified the brakes on these cars are about half again bigger than a regular Trans Am, because he'd road raced and they developed the 1LE package for road racing, and he liked that, so he put the brakes in there, and they put the suspension in from the road racing. So we had all these people kind of doing this type of things, but we didn't have any formal program to do it. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Kelly, and then we'll give some concluding remarks.
Mm-hmm.